It was August 28th in 1963, and Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And as he began what has been said to be one of the most famous and influential speeches of the 20th century, he began by referencing 50 years ago, 100 years prior. It was in 1863 that Abraham Lincoln had proclaimed the Emancipation Proclamation. This had been the decree that slavery had come to an end in the United States. And yet, as 1963, 100 years after Lincoln's proclamation had been announced, freedom was far from a reality for many Americans. Their experience in everyday life was not freedom. It was drinking from a different water fountain, using a different restroom. It was sitting on certain seats of the bus, all depending upon the skin color that you had. The leaders of the civil rights movement knew that the best way forward was not to react with violence, nor was it to react with aggression. And the leaders knew that as they spoke, that every tone, every speech, every word had to be measured so that it was not just the words, but also the tone that was spoken. Because the tone had to encourage those African Americans who were so ready to break the bonds of slavery and oppression, that they needed, these civil rights leaders knew that they needed to measure every word so as to not incite violence. It was leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. who understood that it would be better for non-resistance and non-violence to be the practice of African Americans, so that on television what would be seen is the police brutality as they would beat African Americans who would not resist and not fight back. As MLK spoke from the Lincoln Memorial on that day, he recognized the tenuousness of this moment and that there was need for justice to come in the United States, a justice that had been proclaimed in its Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and a declaration that the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 would come to realization 100 years later. Sin is incredibly insidious. It has a way of being like yeast that can just work its way through a society. It can start just in personal preferences and choices. It can be in the kinds of ways that people think is private and affects no one. But sin has this way of moving from being personal and private to becoming systemic and permeating an entire culture. It has a way of becoming the very fabric of the law system, of justice, so that justice is perverted because sin gets snuck in, just as yeast works through an entire batch of dough. That's how sin often works. In the midst of this grievous nature of sin, Amos saw Israel falling into all sorts of sin. Israel was the northern kingdom that had one time been joined with Judah, the southern kingdom, and Amos was from the southern kingdom of Judah, but he had been called by God to go to this northern kingdom, to proclaim the message of the Lord, that the day of the Lord was coming. The north was in moral and spiritual decline. It had been in rapid decline, and yet there was incredible affluence, there was incredible complacency, and there was incredible idolatry. And yet what Israel had done in those days is they had confused material wealth with blessing. They had confused religious activity with morality. And they had confused a future longing with covenantal security. They had taken all these things and mixed them all together and confused that God was on their side. That because they were God's chosen people, because they were the covenant people, because they had wealth, because they were doing religious activity, that somehow God was still pleased with them. And yet Amos comes in the midst of this, and he speaks. And there are two words that Amos speaks in our passage here this morning that ought to be the sound that resonates in us during Advent, that we live in between the times. And there's a reason why God is veiled, that if people do not see God, if they cannot find him, there is good reason. And it is not because God is merely hidden, as we saw last week. If you were here, we talked about when the power was out, and in the darkness, we talked about the very nature of the God who hides. A God who hides not because he is a secretive God, but because he is a God who does not want to be found where he isn't, but he wants to be found where he is in Jesus Christ. And so Amos speaks, first of all, he speaks to us and he speaks to Israel, and he says, number one, I want you to beware of the dark. Israel's problem was not that they were longing for the future. In fact, it's very clear as we look at Isaiah 5, verse 18, that Israel was longing for the future. But the problem was that Israel was not aware of the problem of darkness. And in the midst of that darkness, Isaiah saw that Amos saw that they had all of their prophecy charts, they had all of their eschatology mapped out. They were looking forward, it says in verse 18, to the day of the Lord, this end of the time, the day when God would come. There was no problem with their eschatology charts. What they were longing for was the future. But the problem was that their expectations of the future were far off. It was so far off, in fact, that the day of the Lord had not resulted in their living morally, in their worshiping faithfully, or in their acting justly. Their actions reflected that they had become so complacent, that they had confused assurance with complacency. That they had taken this idea of being eternally secure in the covenant of God and made it seem as though nothing could disrupt them. Yet Amos comes to disrupt this kind of thinking. He says the day of the Lord is not a day where it's just going to be easy peasy life and pie. It's going to be a day of dread. It's going to be a day where, he says, a man will escape from a lion only to be found by a bear. A man will think that he's secure in his home and lean his hand against the wall only to have a serpent come out of one of the cracks and bite it. It will be like a man who is finally cured of cancer and yet is struck in a vehicle accident on the way home from his last treatment. That's what the day of the Lord is like. It's not a day of ease and comfort. It's a day of dread. It's a dreadful day. Why? Why is it a dreadful day? It is a day where Amos says that God will right wrongs. He will bring all things into his justice, that he will deal with the problem of evil. We see this in verse 20 where Amos says, "Is not the day of the Lord darkness and not light, and gloom with no brightness in it?" God will deal with immoral living. He will deal with faithless worship. He will deal with systemic injustice. But we live in a day, probably not unlike the day of Amos, where people struggle with the idea that God is a God of judgment and justice. Sure, it's fine. It's fine for God to give justice to people like Hitler or Pol Pot or Mussolini. They deserve it. They're evil. It's very clear. But to the average person, well, how could God ever bring about any sort of justice? And in this, God is veiled. Because our conception, an idea of God is so radically confused and so disjointed from who God is that we cannot see God and we only see darkness. God is a God of justice, And yes, he is a God of love. But in our modern day parlance, the idea of a God being a God of love has this notion of sentimentality. He's like an old grandpa who just winks at you when you do something wrong. It's your job to sin, it's my job to forgive, and all is fine. He's the grandpa who never disciplines you. He's the man in the rocking chair who's passively watching as you misbehave. And we think of these little picadillos as no big deal. And yet, if God is truly a God of love, if God is a God who keeps covenant, this is the idea here, that God keeps covenant with his people. In the midst of covenant, just like marriage, there is this sense in which there is a ferociousness about it. Love has a ferocious side. And love ought to have a ferocious side. If love doesn't have any ferociousness to it, it becomes mere mush and sentimentality. And it doesn't do anything other than make you feel warm and fuzzy. But when love is a jealous love, when God is the kind of God who is not just loving and kind in all of his ways, but ferocious, we remember that the picture of God's people throughout the Bible was one where they were compared to a bride, and that God would marry his bride. And it's right for God then to pursue his bride with a ferocious, jealous love. And the kind of ferocious, jealous love is the kind of love that wants to protect his bride, that wants to guard his bride. God had made humanity to be his reflectors so that his bride would go through the earth and fill it with this beauty and glory, the glory of God. But instead of being a people full of the beauty and glory of God, humans decided that, well, there's a song that I've heard by, he's a man who's walked away from the faith, but the words that he sings in this song, it's called Wedding Dress by Derek Webb. And Derek Webb says these words, and they're quite shocking, but it's the words of the Old Testament. He says in this song about a bride who is seeking to be a lover to God, but to follow other gods. He uses these words, I am a whore, I do confess. I put you on like a wedding dress, and I run down the aisle. And there's this idea of, I want to have my hand in your pocket and yet benefit it for myself. That this was the picture of Israel in the Old Testament. People who were to be pursuing God as the lover of their souls and yet chasing after every idol on every high hill. And worship then had become personal and privatized. Do you see that in verses 21 through 23? You notice the word that gets repeated over and over in those verses? Your. It's your feasts. It's your solemn assemblies. You offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings. I won't accept them. I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. Religion had become personalized, privatized, along with morality. And when this happens, when humanity takes morality and says, morality is just personal, and worship ought to be kept private, then what happens is that justice becomes partial. And there is this link. There is a link that runs in the Bible that private worship and personal morality will result in partial justice. A justice that is not impartial, but a justice that favors, that doesn't have the blindness of the scales of justice, of Lady Justice being blind, but rather being one who is partial so that it's for your benefit. This language of your indicates how personal that Israel had made it. It was private worship. It was personal morality. And yet, what does the Lord say about this kind of worship? He says, I hate, I despise, I take no delight, I will not accept them. I will not look on them. Take away from me the noise. I will not listen. In English, we don't see the vivid pictures here that are on display. But in verse 21, it is the language of, it's a stench. When he says, I take no delight, I can't stand the stench, is what the Hebrew says, in your solemn assemblies. In verse 22, it's not just the smell, it's the sight. I will not look upon them. In verse 23, it's not just sight and smell, but it's the sound. Take away from me the noise of your songs. That this is so repugnant that it's affecting all of the senses of God. That his hearing of private worship and personal preferences for morality have become an utter stench. And because it has become a stench to the Lord, because he does not like it, what he says is darkness permeates. This is what the day of the Lord is like. The day of the Lord, you see, you shouldn't be expecting a great ease and comfort on the day of the Lord when your morality is personal and your worship is private. Rather, the day of the Lord ought to affect you. The day of the Lord ought to affect you now that your morals and your worship will affect all of life. This is why John can say in 1 John 3, the reason why the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when he appears, this is the day of the Lord language, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is. And what does 1 John 3:3 say is the result of this? And everyone who thus hopes in him purifies himself, just as he is pure. The day of the Lord affects us now. It affects our morals. It affects our worship. It affects all of life. And yet we live in a world where justice is partial, where morality has become personal, and you ought to keep your worship private. We hear this in the news. Political leaders. Don't let your Catholicism affect you. Don't let it affect your public managing of law, your rule. So what are we to do when we live in a world where God is veiled, where God is masked, where people's morality is personal and their worship is private? Verse 24 tells us that it is not just that we ought to beware of the dark, but second of all, we ought to pursue righteousness. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. In Israel, if you would think of the geographical landscape, if you would know the geographical landscape, it's one where there are wet seasons and dry seasons. And across Israel, there are various rivers or riverbeds, depending on the time of year. If it's wet season, these little streams called wadis, the wadi would suddenly burst its banks and it would overflow. But as the rainy season would go to the dry season, these wadis would go from a mighty flowing stream down to just a little trickle, if not only a dry riverbed. And God says through the prophet Amos, no, what I want justice and righteousness to look like is a stream that never stops flowing. I don't want it to have this ebb and flow cycle. I don't want it to be cyclical in its nature. Let justice roll down like waters, coming down a mountainside. Let righteousness flow like an ever-flowing stream. It never stops. It never dries up. It's not ebbing. It's not ebbing and flowing and changing depending on the season and depending on the circumstance. Justice ought to be justice. There ought to be justice. And it ought to be consistent. And that this nature of justice ought to be foundational so that it doesn't ebb and flow depending on circumstances and personal morality and private worship. Rather, it ought to have this effect that justice should be ever flowing. There are two elements. We don't have time to look through the rest of the book of Amos, but there are two elements to the way that justice was to work itself out. Throughout the book of Amos, even if you go back earlier in the chapter, in chapter 5, Amos talks about having justice or righteousness in the gates of the city. And justice then was to be practiced. This was the place of the court of law. It was the place where decisions were to be made with respect to what God had commanded in the Old Testament. And that God had commanded that people live justly. His law was a good law. And the reason his law was good is that it was for human flourishing. It was for humanity's good. And the two elements of this righteousness, this justice of God was one, it was to love your neighbor as you love yourself. This is how we can't keep morality just personal. Morality has public effects. When we talk about loving your neighbor as you love yourself, it's embedded in all of God's commands. The reason that God had said, do not steal, was to love your neighbor's property. That taking your neighbor's property and claiming it as your own was a lack of respect for the work that your neighbor had done and how they had sacrificed. Similarly, saying, do not bear false witness, don't lie. The reason that God had said this was not just that it's a personal moral choice. Rather, lying would damage your neighbor's reputation and would seek to protect your own reputation at the expense of your neighbor. Therefore, when God says, don't bear false witness, don't lie about your neighbor, uphold your neighbor. Uphold their integrity. Uphold their reputation. Don't damage it for the sake of your own preservation of reputation. Or, as God would say in the last commandment, do not covet. Don't desire what your neighbor has and be jealous of him. Don't let that inner desire create this turmoil, because what it will do is it will cause anger and sin and jealousy, which will not look out for your neighbor's good, but causes you to look out for your own good. Therefore, righteousness, when the Bible speaks of righteousness, it has this idea of morals having a public implication. That all of morality affects other people. It's not private. It's not kept to yourself. Therefore, if loving your neighbor had this public effect, the second aspect of the righteousness that God is demanding is not only the love of neighbor, but second of all, the love of God. It's seeing that when God gives commands, his commands are good. They're for your good. They're for my good. They're for the common good. And this was the understanding of Israel's law. It was not an oppressive law. It was a law for flourishing. This is why when the book of Deuteronomy would talk about blessings for keeping the law and curses for disobeying the law, the language of blessing is not just this language of some sort of spiritual, mystical happiness that would be bestowed upon you. It's this idea of flourishing, of well-being. That if you follow God's ways, what happens is the way of life is enhanced. And so even when Jesus would teach in the Sermon on the Mount, he would say, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek. This is the language of, this is where human flourishing is found. It's seeing that my ways are good, that God's commands are for life and not for death. And this is what righteousness is. It is found in saying God's ways are good. It loves neighbor and it loves God. It honors that his ways are for our good and for my neighbor's good and for my good. That my morality is not private. My morality has an effect on everyone around me. Therefore, the choices that I make in the dark don't stay in the dark. But my deeds done in the light will be exposed. I hadn't planned to go to John 3, but these are exactly the words that Jesus speaks at the end of John 3. John says these words. He quotes Jesus in John 3:19. And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light, because their works were evil. Verse 20, for everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light. Why? Lest his works should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God. But the problem we have is that our righteousness is not ever flowing. It ebbs and flows. There is not 100% consistency. There is only one who is ever, always, only righteous. And his worship and his witness were for the common good. When Jesus came, the things that he did were not only fulfilling the Old Testament promises, they were bringing about the life that is found in God. This is why Isaiah could say in Isaiah 61 that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, referring to Jesus. Jesus will quote this in the synagogue. Because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, he has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God. That in Jesus Christ, in his first coming, he came to set the prisoner free. He came to give sight to the blind. He came to give the lame the ability to walk. He opened deaf ears, opened blind eyes, and in doing this, he showed that the favor of God had come. But there is a day where his judgment will come. And in that day, morality will not remain private at all. But humans, they want to keep morality personal, and they want worship to be kept private. And the result of personal worship and private morality resulted in the most innocent of human beings being unjustly prosecuted, so that he would go to a cross, falsely accused and condemned, nailed to a cross. It was personal morality and private worship that sent Christ to the cross in injustice. This is why when we have personal morality and private worship, it results in partiality. It does not bring about the justice of God. If we are to be consistent, we must pursue righteousness and recognize that our righteousness will have an effect in this world. And yet it will not always be received with great joy and happiness. It will chafe against those whose deeds of darkness want to be kept in the dark. It will cause people to see you can't remain hidden, that God will expose all things. And yet the promise of the good news that Jesus proclaims and that he brings, and that we are told in 1 John 1:9, is that if we confess our sins, he is faithful and what? Just. This is his justice. He's dealt with sin at the cross, and he will forgive. And this is the way that we make our way back to God. It is through confession. It is through repentance. It is in pursuing the righteous life that is in Jesus, so that then our choices, that they are changed in terms of their implications. That we can have this fresh start, that we can begin anew. And Advent is that season where we come and we long for the day of God to rule and reign. But in ruling and reigning, he must reign in each one of our hearts in every sphere of life. This is why, as Martin Luther King Jr., as he got up on the Lincoln Memorial on August 28th, 1963, he would say these words: 100 years since Lincoln had given the he said 50 years ago, 100 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon of light and hope to millions of Negro slaves who have been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the night long of captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. And so Martin Luther King Jr. would go on to say that it was time to cash the check of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all people. He was asked, what would give you satisfaction? To which in his speech he said, "We are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness flows like an ever-flowing stream," quoting Amos 5:24. Because our morals have public consequences. Our worship has a profound public impact. It will either shout doom and dread and destruction, or it will bring life and liberty. Christ has come to set us free from sin and death. Christ will come again to judge the world. He calls us to live publicly as his people, pursuing righteousness, loving justly and loving justice and mercy, and walking humbly before him. And that in that message, we can say, like Martin Luther King Jr. said, on that day, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last.